for both post-occupancy BIM webinar with Chuck Meese from Autodesk's AEC Solutions team and Brian Haynes from FM Systems. During the presentation, the lines will be muted, but if you should have any questions, please enter them in the panel on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will answer them at the end. Now, I will turn it over to Chuck Meese.
Actually, I'll go ahead and jump in there, Chuck. This is Brian. I'm a director with FM Systems. I couldn't be happier today to talk about one of my absolute favorite topics. I know it's Chuck's favorite as well. Preparing for post-occupancy BIM, that's building information modeling after a building becomes operational. I'm really excited to be co-presenting today with Chuck Meese, a former colleague of mine at Autodesk. Chuck is another guy that I can say strongly that is very excited about this topic. Chuck, I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Yeah, Brian, to say I'm strongly excited about this topic is kind of a little bit of an understatement. For me, post-occupancy BIM is like my entire 30-year professional career rolled into a single topic. So really quick background was I graduated and started practicing architecture 30 years ago. A lot of that time was spent doing facilities-related on-call architecture for large aerospace concerns. Left architectural practice, started a facilities consulting company, and then ultimately made the transition to Autodesk. So in looking at this from a lot of different perspectives, it's a subject I'm tremendously passionate about. In particular at Autodesk, for the last 7 years, I've been focused at having conversations with building owners on the value of BIM post-occupancy. And what I've learned in that conversation is something very interesting. And the primary thing that I've learned is that when we start to talk about BIM post-occupancy, it's really not about technology. Where I've seen these owners' conversations struggle is when we get too deeply into the technology too quickly and understand that what we really should be talking about is the process behind the technology. Because if we can open this up, and we can have a process discussion, eventually we can then understand the process issues, and we can overlay technology onto those process issues, and that's how we'll ultimately achieve a solution. So what Brian and I are going to walk you through today is an agenda that kind of looks at what's the current opportunity. We've talked about this idea of process, and count how many times today the two guys from the technology companies use the word process instead of technology, and I think you'll understand that we passionately believe it's really all about the process. Then we're going to talk about the three questions, and we'll help you understand this simple methodology to start to understand how you can take advantage of this. Then Brian's going to help you focus on the FM Interact platform and some of the opportunity examples specific from FM Systems, and then we'll come back and we'll wrap it all up and we'll help you understand how we can do this from a process perspective and put it all back together. If there was one key takeaway from today's presentation that I'd love for all of you to do, it's to go buy this book on Amazon called The Owner's Dilemma from Barbara Bryson. Barbara is an AIA fellow. She's also the former vice president of capital construction at Rice University, and she's now in a similar position at the University of Arizona. And in the book, The Owner's Dilemma, she makes a couple interesting statements we're going to highlight today. The first of which is that ours is the only trillion-dollar industry in the history of the world in which clients have routinely demanded the most inefficient processes. So if you think about this from the perspective of design, build, design assist, CM at risk. It's all of these contract models and things that create processes where we have handover points. And it's those handover points where we have very natural inefficiencies that crop up. If we have to move information from one stakeholder to the next stakeholder, and we have to do that via some form of lowest common denominator, invariably there's going to be information dropouts. And these process inefficiencies are where the opportunity exists for building information modeling. And here's the reason why. And this is in one slide why I say this is about process and not about technology. Because if we can understand and identify these process inefficiencies at these handover points, we can then use the building information modeling as a catalyst to process change. It can become a platform upon which we can hopefully bridge some of these major handover points and create a much more efficient and smooth workflow. And I think it's really important to understand what these process inefficiencies cost and exactly how they affect everybody involved in the process.
So the National Institute of Standards and Testing, or NIST, actually did research which showed that the cost of that interoperability actually had a dollar value associated with it. And that the dollar value associated with it actually showed that owners really paid the most significant interoperability costs. They broke that down into a number of cost categories. They called them avoidance, mitigation, and delay. But what it really comes down to is the inefficiency inherent in the business process, the redundant facilities management systems costs. In other words, we're going to have to do duplicate data entry into multiple systems. The operations and maintenance staff productivity loss of having to do rework, re-entering information, lost data, having to go back into the construction process, looking at paper documentation, and then simply idled employee costs, which assumes things such as employees who are waiting for information that's not readily available at their fingertips. And they actually estimated this to be 23 cents per square foot per year. So for a 100,000 square foot building, that's going to cost you $23,000 in simply interoperability costs related to technology. We actually think it's a lot worse than 23 cents a square foot when you start to look at all of the processes, all of the technology, et cetera, that is involved in managing a large portfolio of buildings. So think about a facility manager's problem who's managing a large portfolio. They've got multiple locations. They may have different countries, different regions, campuses, et cetera. So really multiplying that interoperability problem. We've also got technology. They could be using AutoCAD to manage their floor plans, and they may be adopting a BIM-based process. They may be using different browsers across their locations, different databases, multiple different mobile platforms, et cetera. File formats. We've got some file formats that are intelligent. Think of a Revit model as being an intelligent file format, but then what about a photograph or maybe a PDF in a raster format? Not a lot of information is embedded in the intelligence of those formats. So getting the data out or information out can also be another area where interoperability occurs. Then there's the data consistency and quality. If you don't have standards, if information coming in off of, let's say, your construction or renovation and retrofit projects, or perhaps different locations, are all using different data standards, the quality is different, it's not complete, you don't have historical information, there's another area where interoperability occurs. Then we've got accessibility problems. If we have some people who have secure access to information and then other people who don't, simply because they don't have the right technology or they don't have a username and password, then they're suddenly disconnected from the process. And then last but not least, we've got workflows. We may have different workflow standards across one building, maybe all of our buildings, maybe different locations, et cetera. And we really think that that 23 cents cost per square foot is a very conservative estimate. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it back over to you, Chuck, for a real case study here.
So trying to validate, if you think about clients with multi-million square feet portfolios and you start to multiply 23 cents a square foot, the first thing you want to ask yourself the question is that number believable? Can we really believe that? So we did a very simple straw man survey with a consultant who was working at Sandia National Labs at the time, and we took a look at, is that 23 cents a square foot believable? In this particular straw man survey, we focused on the maintenance organization and the amount of time that they spent looking up, recreating, or somehow finding information that was in somebody else's head somewhere in the process and got lost by whatever means. Maybe it's the 3-inch 3-ring binder they can't find. Maybe it's the drawings they can't find. Maybe it's information that didn't get transferred into their CMMS system. Maybe it's I get frustrated, I jump in my Cushman cart, I run across campus, and I come back. That at Sandia's campus added up to 40 cents per square foot, was the amount of time that their maintenance people spent recreating information to go do a work order. And that was when we thought to ourselves, okay, there's opportunity here. And the opportunity here is best summed by Barbara when we go back to her book again, and she says that BIM is the perfect complement to collaborative teams, especially those that are willing to care about the fluidity of information sharing and coordination rather than the sanctity of the drawings. And as a non-practicing architect myself, when an AIA fellow tells you that it's not about the drawings, you should probably listen. And I thought that was tremendously revealing when she talks about the idea that BIM is a complement to collaborative teams. So that, I think, leads us very naturally into the next question. How do we create a collaborative environment across all of these stakeholders, including your own internal stakeholders as an owner's organization and all of the silos that you have internally? And I think the methodology for building that collaborative framework boils down to 3 questions. And when I work with owners, I ask them to continuously iterate through these 3 questions. The first question is, who's going to use the data? Until you try to understand who's going to use the data, you're solving an undefined problem. Once you understand who's going to use the data, then you can actually move on to the next question, which is, what data am I going to need and how am I going to get it? Now we're starting to define the solution, and last but not least, we have to make sure we maintain the integrity of the solution, and we do that by asking the question, how will it all be maintained? Because if we can't answer the 3rd question, my point is we should probably go back to the first question and start over again. I want to drill down a little more deeply into each of these 3 questions. So the idea of who's going to use the data, this is truly how you define the problem you're trying to solve. And if you were to ask me, the number one issue that I've seen working with owners organization is the concept of solving an undefined problem. Because until we understand who's going to use the data, we don't really understand the problem, and we start to gain some insight. We start to understand that efficiencies can be gained if data is easily accessible. The Sandia Strawman survey showed that. The amount of time they spend recreating data, that's something we need to work on. We know the building information model has a role. I talked about that idea of the building information model being a consistent data conduit, but in order to do any form of post-occupancy BIM integration, you have to stop and understand the people who are ultimately going to consume that data, what they do, why they need the data, and how they use the data. And only when we truly spend the time to learn this can we understand the problem. And this is what I say when I mean, this is where I've seen most owners' organizations struggle. We start immediately talking about technology. I need this system to talk to that system and this system to talk to that system. And you stop and you ask the question, why? Who's going to use that data? And when you understand who's going to use that data, then you very naturally progress into the next question, which is, now that we know who's going to use the data, what data are we going to collect and how are we going to get it? Because who's going to use the data defines the problem, what data you're going to collect and how defines the solution. Because if you truly understand that person, then you can start to understand what data we're going to collect. And one important thing as owners that I think you need to do is you need to transition your thinking from as built to as maintained. And those are 2 very different thought processes, and let me define what I mean by that. Typically now, you receive as-built, some form of as-built documentation from your A&Es and constructors who are doing the work. That as-built documentation is designed to document what the condition or the state of the facility was at some point in time. I'd love to say when they turned it over to you, but we all know it's not true. And the challenge with as-built information is also that in the building information modeling world, the as-built information is going to be that constructor's fabrication model with all the embeds and hangers and all of the things that they need to construct that facility. You probably don't need that. In fact, in most cases, you don't need that much level of information to maintain a facility. So you shift this idea to what do we need to maintain a facility? Because when you do that and you apply the fact that we've taken the time to understand our end users, we can start to target specific data. If it's asset data, is it make, model, serial number? What are we trying to capture? For space data, is it room attributes, finish attributes? What is the information? What are the other use cases and personas that are going to happen? Because when you do this and you apply the idea of what data we're going to collect to who's going to use the data, the biggest thing that happens is the amount of data that you're going to use typically decreases because you're no longer boiling the ocean. You're not trying to solve everybody's problem. You've focused and with great intent pursued your solution. And that typically reduces the amount of data that you're going to capture. And again, the process is fairly complex. Brian, why don't you talk about some of that process complexity?
Absolutely, Chuck. So one of the things I really like to hammer home is that a huge part of the success of this process, and as Chuck was saying, it is a process, is really understanding that the majority of the people adding information into the model may not even know that a model exists. They're not BIM technicians, they're not CAD technicians, they're not people who are going to be having a sophisticated handle on the 3D attribution of the model, but they're involved in the process, and for this to be successful, it's best to start very early in the AECO process. So starting right here, we're talking about the design and engineering team providing some fairly rudimentary, probably not entirely accurate information very early on, asset IDs, some descriptions of the space and the equipment that's going to be going into the building based upon the design and engineering process, some performance data, the location of where those that equipment or perhaps space is going to be. It then gets supplemented by the general contractors and subs if they've been given an opportunity to do things such as add the manufacturer, the model, the install date, by the warranty information. This is the actual conditions once that piece of equipment is installed in the facility. Passing that on to the commissioning process, once the building owner begins to get involved, they may do things such as add an asset tag number, which could ultimately make it very easy for a technician or someone within the facility to walk up with a mobile device, scan a barcode or a QR code in a door jamb or maybe on a piece of equipment, bring up information about that room. We really truly believe that all of these people are actively providing input to the model and maintaining it over its life cycle. And if it's done in a proper way with standards and quality, then that model is going to be much more ready for design and engineering once that first retrofit or renovation occurs. Maybe there's going to be an addition to a facility. If the model's been maintained accurately to a specific data standard that the owner has deemed necessary throughout its operations, you're going to be a lot more successful. So we really believe that BIM, as Chuck was saying, is not really about just a Revit model, for instance. It's really about the process that's taken into account when doing the maintenance of that as maintained or operational Revit model.
And that is the transition, Brian, to the as maintained model, right? So here's the things in the second half of that question. We've talked a lot about what data you're going to collect. Let's talk now about how are you going to capture that data. Because as Brian mentioned, in a typical scenario, the data might be available from multiple stakeholders at different times in the process. So you have to start thinking about what is the process that I'm going to create that captures that information when it's available at the right time by the right stakeholder, and who can best capture that data. Again, if we've captured the data, then how do we bring all of that data together? Are we going to take advantage of a workflow such as COBie? Are we going to take advantage of other workflows that allow us to aggregate and bring all of that data together? From an Autodesk perspective, enter the cloud. We've been working with FM Systems on a workflow that integrates with our BIM 360 platform that allows you to take advantage of the cloud and take those initial design intent models that have that programming data and that design intent data and then push them out to the cloud to take advantage of field collection of data. So each stakeholder at the right time, when that right piece of information is available, can capture that using a mobile device. Once we've captured that data, then we can use that data to then update all of that field collected data back into the model for all of the attributes that we didn't have available to us at the time, and then all of that data can be packaged both graphically and attribution-wise and then moved downstream. So that then talks about how do we move that data downstream and what is the benefit for us. So we've talked about the idea that once the data is all captured, there's multiple options for moving it downstream. Simple imports and exports, rich data transfers through COBie, but the key to the discussion we're having today is the FM Systems FM Interact bidirectional integration with the Revit platform that allows that information to be exchanged bidirectionally. So once the model has been informed through that cloud-based process we described, it will move automatically downstream, populating assets, populating space information, etc., into the FM Interact platform. And that bidirectional exchange of data becomes incredibly important when it comes to answering the third question, which is how will the data be maintained? Because I think this is the question where most people trip up. They can do an initial import, they can do an initial populate, but they don't have a process in place to maintain that data and keep it current. And if you don't have a process in place, how do you ensure integrity and confidence in your data set? Because the first time somebody opens that data set up, and the information they see isn't current, they lose confidence in it. And that begs the question, if it can't be maintained, why capture it at all? That non-current data risks the perceived integrity of the entire system. And here's the biggest piece of advice I can give you. It's not about the model. It's really not about the model. It's about understanding the separation of the graphical data from the attribution. And ask yourself the question, in many cases, does the model even need to be updated? If I replace a pump, do I need to go back into the Revit model and update that? Graphically, it's still a pump, still in the right location. Probably a more efficient process to take advantage of that FM Interact bidirectional integration to swap that asset out in the FM Interact asset model and let that integration reinform the model as to the state of that data. That is how you maintain integrity in this entire system, and that's why we're here to talk to you about today. And Brian, that's a very natural transition for you to talk specifically about some of your case studies and the FM Interact platform in particular.
That's right, Chuck, and thanks. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and talk about post-occupancy BIM, really focusing on an FM system specific solution, FM Interact. So what I like to do is, before I begin this discussion, is always to sort of level set how we talk about lifecycle BIM versus how maybe an AEC team might talk about lifecycle BIM, because we come at it from a very facilities management centric direction. So we tend to think of post-occupancy BIM as not being project-based, it's portfolio-based. Most of our customers have very large portfolios of large complex buildings. They've got projects going on all the time. They need those models to come in a way that fits within their portfolio, that have the information in those models that classify space, classify their assets in ways that make sense to them. So we really like to think of this as a portfolio-based approach to managing building information models after occupancy begins. We also strongly focus on building elements that need to be maintained. These are the things that the maintenance team are going to have to keep updated and operating properly in a safe manner on a day-to-day basis. This is the preventive maintenance scheduling. These are the things that need corrective maintenance done to them by facility teams. We also tend to focus on the things that are important in the model as being the elements that need to be inventoried. The furniture, you need to get an accurate furniture count. You want to know how much carpet you have on your floor. You want to know what the life cycle cost of replacing the wall finishes is going to be. Those types of things that need to be inventoried, we also place a heavy emphasis on having those inside of the model. Excuse me. The last thing, or the last two things, that needs to be pragmatic and easily maintainable. Like I said, most of the people participating in this process, and I'm going to show a slide here in a minute that highlights that, are not Revit technicians. They're not BIM technicians. They may not even be that technically savvy, but what they are is subject matter expertise in the area, in their specific area of facilities management. And we truly believe that this is collaborative by nature. So people who are providing information, maybe we've got that maintenance technician over there on the right with a mobile device who's doing a preventive maintenance task on a fire extinguisher. We may have somebody in asset management who needs to order fire extinguishers. We may have somebody who needs to actually place those in the drawings. We may need to look at things such as emergency exit planning. We need to look at space management, et cetera. So that essentially makes it collaborative by nature. So we believe that all of the BIM life cycle participants are anybody within a facilities organization who may need to touch that data that's housed in a model or multiple models in a system like FM Interact. That could be people like space planners, move managers, even lease administrators, human resources people. How often do we think of human resources as being involved in a BIM-based process? Well, those are the people who have all of the information on the employees who occupy our space. They know where those people sit. We can connect to that information and provide it up in the model. We really believe that BIM lifecycle participation is really a collaborative process and really highlights the value of being able to use a cloud-based product like FM Interact to provide appropriate access to all those participants. The other thing is, and those of you who understand Star Wars will get this reference, these aren't the models you're looking for. And I always bring up this slide. First of all, it gets a chuckle, and second of all, it sort of makes a really strong point for us, and that is traditionally what we've gotten in the past in terms of our customers who have been bringing models to us. In our first Revit integration was back around 2009, 2010. We started getting models from customers. They were often maybe fabrication level models, they were construction models, they were used for sequencing, maybe collage detection, and they really weren't the right model. So what we've decided is that over time, several models are created during the AEC and into operations process. We've got the design team models, then we've got our construction models that are used for things such as collage detection, coordination, and maybe quantity takeoff. We've got our BIM as-built model, which is a great record with fabrication level detail potentially. It's sort of that record of what happened in the building, but it's not difficult, it's not easy to maintain during operations. So if you could take the best of all of these models, we recommend that building owners adopt something such as a as-maintained model, what we call the BIM FM model, which is really derived from the as-built model. We remove a lot of the extraneous details and sheets. We really lighten up the model quite a bit. We don't focus on things like structure, which is not maintained on a daily basis. And we really look at those items within the model, primarily the MEP components, the spaces, the walls, et cetera, that really make up those things that are important for a day-to-day operational standpoint. So, Chuck, I'm going to go ahead and pass this back to you for the value of space management.
Yeah. So let's talk about, right? So the value of a building information model as it comes in space management focuses around the idea that building information models inherently understand space boundaries, right? When you draw four walls and they enclose a room, the building information model knows that a room, and essentially you eliminate the polylining process. And I think we all know how painful polylining can be, right? I heard a quote one time that I've always remembered, and that is, polylining is what bad architects have to do in hell for all eternity. And as someone who's polylined a few million square feet in my life, I agree with that statement very much. But then you start to think about the idea that as we're using some of the intelligence in the building information model, that those space classifications can understand boundary positions. Based on how we're classifying the space, the boundary object may go inside face of wall, it may go center line of wall, etc., because the building information model understands that. They also understand the effects of penetration on space calculation. What I mean by that is if we're using BOMA standards to calculate space and the window exceeds 50% of the vertical height of the wall, we get to go to the face of the glass. If not, we need to go to the windowsill. How do you know that in an AutoCAD drawing? You don't know how high that wall is, so you make some assumptions. And in many cases, we've talked to a lot of organizations who've made some wrong assumptions. It's also that the idea that space can be easily scheduled and quantified inside that model. And most importantly, once again, with the bidirectional connection between FM Interact, it extends that value of the Revit spaces to the entire FM team. So we can take that model that's coming out of that process and we can move that downstream. And Brian's going to talk to you about a very interesting and appropriate case study that happened with Xavier University.
Yeah, we've got a couple of really good case studies here. These are customers that we've got these just really terrific relationships with. And Xavier, self-admittedly, the facilities management team, Greg Meyer, said he sort of stumbled into what he called accidental BIM. And that was one day he walked into a project room where they were doing a construction coordination meeting for this new fourth building campus addition, and he saw the Revit models up on the wall that they were reviewing, and he realized all of the tremendous amount of information that was already being put into those models from the project team that could be used downstream for facilities management. So what they were able to do was then get FM involved in that process, make sure that the models that were coming out of the design and construction process actually took facilities management into consideration. This allowed them to be able to save thousands of hours of data entry. Greg was able to bring these models online very quickly and have all of the space information automatically synchronized into FM Interact, and this would have saved hundreds of hours of having to walk those spaces, manually enter all of that information in. Using a traditional CAD-based process, you would have to polyline AutoCAD drawings. You would have to really strip out all of the intelligence in a Revit model and sort of redo it. It's one of those interoperability issues that we were talking about earlier. So they were able to take Revit plus FM Interact and save thousands of hours of data entry and then get their facilities, their brand new facilities, up and running very quickly. Some of the lessons they learned was not just model for design and construction. This is really what we run into with many of our customers, but we try to get them to understand that they need to model during that process with facilities management needs in mind. The BIM-FM Consortium, which is a group that Chuck and I collaborate with on a monthly basis, we did an asset attribution research project, and one of the stunning answers that came out of this research was that about 80% of building owners have a post-occupancy data plan for how they're going to maintain those facilities. About 40% of them have a pre-occupancy or construction plan for how they're going to maintain data. We're really trying to change that. We're trying to get them to inject their facilities knowledge and needs early in the process so that when these models come out, they're ready for facilities management. They also recommended that you understand that the tools that your general contractor and subs are using, see if you can get them involved in the process by providing requirements and guidelines that enable them to actually include the proper attribution and needs into the model. And then provide the model and data requirements up front. So don't do this after the building's complete and then try to put this information into the model. Provide your requirements up front and try to get that in there. The second, all right, Chuck, I'm going to go ahead and hand it back over to you for the asset management discussion now. Chuck, are you muted, Chuck? All right, I'll go ahead. I think Chuck's
I actually was, Brian. Sorry about that.
Right, there you go. It's okay. So the value of BIM.
I should be back now, right?
Yeah, you are.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. Voice over IP went out on me for a little bit. So, I mean, Brian, the quote you had on that last slide was so totally appropriate, right? The designers and contractors already have the information that I want. Why should I have to recreate it? And I think in one sentence from Greg Meyer, that's exactly what you should be focused on. And that applies to assets. So if you think about the value of building information modeling as it applies to assets, it's really about assisting in that field collection of data about all of those assets. Think about that workflow we talked about earlier in the 3 questions and how each stakeholder captures a bit of information at a time it's available. And it's also then about capturing that information and taking advantage of the bidirectional integration with FM Interact to move that data downstream and dramatically reduce the amount of time you spend populating those databases. But then you can start to extend that value prop when you start to think about visualization. So can I get the maintenance person to the right piece of equipment the first time and actually understand where he's at, where he's going, and what he's going to have to do? Because if that piece of equipment has to be above a ceiling, how high is it above the ceiling? Does my organization have a requirement that above a certain height I have to use a lift versus a ladder? If that's the case, then it's going to really change his workflow process. And then that helps understand some of those regulatory concerns. So in the world of healthcare, not having all of that data captured while the air handler was powered up before it was turned over can affect the compliance with your first JACO post-occupancy inspection, right? So can we integrate all of these systems together so we can capture that information and move it seamlessly downstream, help visualize and eliminate that painful process of populating a CMMS system? And Brian, I think you're going to talk about your MathWorks case study as an example of that.
That's correct. All right, let me go ahead to the next slide. All right, so another really great example. MathWorks is an example of a customer. They actually did have BIM or Revit savvy technicians on their facilities management staff. We don't see this very often, although we see it changing. We see many, many more facility managers coming to regional conferences like Midwest University or BIM workshops. We also see them showing up at much larger conferences like Autodesk University. So people who are in operations are starting to get Revit savvy. We're really excited about that. MathWorks actually had an opportunity because they had technicians on staff. They knew they wanted to move to a BIM-based process for managing their facilities. They did this by taking advantage of the work that was being done on a highly technical building that was being built at their Apple Hill campus. Exciting new facility. And with Revit and FM Interact, MathWorks was able to leverage an immense amount of high quality space and asset data that was in their model. Now, to their credit, they came back to me and they said, you know what, maybe we actually got a little overzealous. We probably put too much information into our Revit family. So one of the lessons learned that they learned was really focusing on the information that you can maintain on a daily basis with your current existing facility staff and the workflow processes that they currently use. You don't want to be disruptive in a way that's going to have a negative impact on the way your facilities are operating. So some of the lessons learned was room numbers matter. I really love to go back to this because I was actually, before I got into software many years ago, I was a space planner and management analyst at the University of Arizona. And I once remember getting we had a large aerospace facility that was built, and we got the drawings for that facility, and the architect had numbered all of the spaces on the room on a grid layout, which had nothing to do with the reality of how those rooms were ultimately going to be numbered, which made it really difficult. One, we had to renumber everything, and two, track where things actually were going to be in accordance with the schedules that they had produced. So MathWorks learned that room numbers matter. Communicate your numbering and naming conventions early to everybody who's going to be involved in the modeling process. This involves the engineering teams, anybody doing any of the engineering work, the architectural teams, the subcontractors, etc. They believe strongly that BIM data savvy project leads from both the AEC and the owner standpoint working together was key to their success, and that the owner and FM needs to be involved early to help resolve issues and keep the project moving. I love this because I've been trying to get facilities managers to be in the room during design and construction conversations, even if it's just coordination meetings early on, so they can ensure that the model that they ultimately get is the one that they want. So identify those BIM savvy subs if possible. They may be needed to create much of the asset data that's actually going to go into the models. MathWorks was one of the early creators of a detailed BIM deliverable guide. A lot of lessons learned that we've learned. Chuck is going to share here in a little bit after I do run through a couple of demonstrations. There's actually quite a few guidelines that have been produced by a number of organizations like Penn State University, et cetera, which you can download and access now. We've got one of our own that we just released called the BIM FM Guide. And they actually made BIM data management and quality a topic in coordination meetings. So ensuring that the conversation in the AEC team included FM needs was really exciting. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you that this is not something to aspire to. This is something that you can do now. Our product, FM Interact, has a direct bi-directional integration to Autodesk Revit. We're very excited about that. I'm going to show you that in a minute. What that means is that I can change information in the model. It updates FM Interact out in the cloud. I change data out in the cloud with FM Interact. It updates the model. We're also very excited to now have a API level integration with Autodesk's A360 large model viewer. I'm going to show you a short demonstration of that as well. So let me just go ahead and jump into the bi-directional Revit integration. Right now I'm starting in Revit. I'm just going to simply go into the ground floor floor plan. You'll notice that we've got a plug-in toolbar that goes into Revit that allows me to bi-directionally connect via secure username and password and a web service this model to an underlying FM Interact database. I'm going to go in here and I'm this area on this floor plan, and I'm going to, I've been given permission, privileges as a Revit user to modify this information. All of the data that you're seeing in these drop-downs, such as the space type, space classification, that's all actually coming from FM Interact, from our relational database that's running behind the scenes here. I'm going to make a couple of changes, and I'm going to save. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to now pop out into FM Interact. This is that exact same drawing. It's bi-directionally connected at the data level to that model. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit the information now in FM Interact. I may be a space planner, facility team member that's been given permission to change this. I'm going to change the space type on this back to a private office from an exam room. And I'm going to hit save, and you'll notice that the color automatically updated based upon that process. And now I'm going to go right back into Revit, and I'm going to see that, yep, that data actually changed. So this is not an import-export. This is a highly secure web service that allows you to bi-directionally pass data back and forth between Revit and FM Interact. The next thing I want to show is our support for the Autodesk A360 large model viewer. This is that exact same model that's been uploaded into FM Interact, the one that you were just looking at in Revit. Got these really nice controls to be able to stream this large model directly to the browser quickly and smoothly, and this allows me to then zoom in on this model. I'm going to go ahead and select a piece of equipment on the roof, and you'll notice, I'm going to pause here for a second because I want you to see this. all of this data down here below is actually coming from the FM Interact database. It's connected to that object, and it's linked bidirectionally between the model and our FM Interact database. So now I'm just going to go ahead and show you that not only does FM Interact track that data, but we track an immense amount of detail about a building asset, far beyond just the attribution. We look at things such as work orders that have been exercised against that piece of equipment, archived work orders, the equipment details, where it's located, when it was placed in service, when its warranty is due, PM schedules, documents and images, even a BAS log for a building automation system. If you've got that connected through our FM Interact integration component, you can ultimately see all of that data if it's available. Now, the last one I wanted to show, we've really made a huge push into mobile enabling all of our offerings over the last couple of years. We've got support for mobile devices. The next thing I'm going to show you is that we've got a product called FM Mobile, which extends FM Interact to mobile devices such as iPads, Androids, iPhones, etc. The same exact capability. This is the Autodesk Large Model Viewer running within my iPad, and I'm able to access that exact same piece of equipment, bring up the attribution. Once again, all of this data is coming directly from the Revit model and flowing into the FM Interact database, really making it easy for technicians, even technicians, to potentially access that model out in the field, click on a component, find it easily, interact with a task that's been assigned to them for corrective maintenance or preventive maintenance, take photos, attach them to the data. All of that we consider being part of the building lifecycle and part of the BIM-based process. So Chuck, I'm going to go ahead and pass it right back to you to wrap things up.
Yeah, so let's talk about, okay, so we've talked to you about a lot. How do we put this all together, right? So there's some certain components that we've seen owners successfully use to start to create a process around doing all this. The first one is, if we think about the three questions, and we start with who's going to use the data, you really have to look at this end user understanding. Do you need to go as formal as developing a persona like the one we saw on the slide? Not necessarily, but you do have to take time to go out and learn about those stakeholders. And notice I said go out. So I've been involved in multiple of these discussions with owners, and I can tell you that I've had limited success when we've brought maintenance people or operations people into a conference room and talked to them. When we went out and spent time with them and saw what they did, we got a significantly higher amount of understanding for what they do. We think about the second question, right? What data are you going to collect and how? You need to start influencing that, or if you don't already have them, you need to start developing your BIM project execution plans, your model development specifications, your model data QA/QC tools, and then thinking about that data collection transfer format, or do we have the ability to take advantage of a bidirectional interchange like the FM Interact platform? And then last but not least, how will it be maintained? As Brian mentioned, we're seeing owners start to develop more and more along the lines of data maintenance plans, but I'm a very passionate believer that where you have a vendor integration support like you do with FM Interact, that makes data maintenance significantly easier. So the good news is, to put together this style of documentation, you don't have to start from scratch. There's a lot of things that are already out there in industry that you can take advantage of. So the first one is, from a contractual standpoint, level of development standpoint, you can look to the AIA or the AGC BIM form. From a data transfer or data standard format, you can look at COBE, you can look at the National BIM standard. But when you start to think about how do we put together this from a process standpoint, if you have no guidelines in place, look to some of the stuff that's out there in industry right now. A good example would be the Penn State guidelines and the ability of those Penn State guidelines to help you understand, develop a strategy, develop an execution plan, and then most importantly, how's it going to affect your contracts. You can also then look at the project planning and execution guide for an individual project. And as Brian mentioned, FM Systems has now released a BIM FM guide, which I've had the pleasure of participating in and reviewing, and I think it's a great document for getting started. So you probably feel a lot like this right now. because Brian and I have just given you multiple years of our passion around this subject in the last 44 minutes. So if we've overwhelmed you a little bit, I completely understand that. Let's break it down into some things that we really want you to walk away with in this discussion. First of all, that unequivocally, this is a process discussion. We'll overlay technology on it, but we really have to start by having a discussion around process. When we do that, then we understand that we have to talk to those final consumers, and we have to. When I work with owners, I always ask one question. You contract with industry to design and construct your facilities. Why do you make the assumption that industry knows what you need to manage a facility? We don't. You have to tell us, and you do that by learning your own internal consumers' needs. Once that's done, apply the 3 questions. Iterate through these over and over and over again. And when you do so, what you'll find is you're going to focus your efforts, and the process will become much more manageable. And most importantly, you have to be willing to say no. When somebody says, I need 45 fields of data for a piece of mechanical equipment, but you can't answer the 3 questions, be willing to say no. What typically happens is we get down to the 8 or 10 or 12 or 15 or whatever it is that person really needs, and now we can understand that. And here's my biggest piece of advice. You work with contractors, architects, and engineers because of their ability to problem solve. Don't take that ability away when you talk to them about lifecycle BIM. In other words, describe for them the outcomes you're trying to achieve. Don't be prescriptive in telling them how to do it necessarily, right? So in other words, describe a process. I want these 14 attributes captured and reinformed back into my Revit model, validated in this way, okay, or validated in some way, and then I want to move that downstream into FM Interact. That's describing a problem, not prescribing a solution. And I think they can help you very much creatively solve that. But here's my biggest piece of advice for all of you. So we've talked to you about a lot of stuff. So as you begin your process of looking through all of this, I want you to start with this thought. This is how, when you're really bored on an airplane between New York and Seattle, you graphically represent thinking inside the box. I was asked to present this concept at a BIM forum, and as I was flying to Seattle to do that, I started thinking about the idea of, for some unknown reason, somewhere along the way, we've come up with this idea of thinking outside the box, and that it's better than thinking inside the box. And when it comes to this discussion, my point to you is that's absolutely not the way to think about this, and here's what I mean by that. Architects, engineers, and constructors get paid to think inside their boxes because that's what they do. You don't want them thinking outside their boxes. You don't want an architect doing means and methods. You don't want a constructor doing design. You don't want an engineer performing certain tasks, right? You want them doing what they do. But in order to create a truly collaborative workflow process, what you have to do is teach them how to think inside your box. Don't ask them to step outside their box. Help them understand your boxes. Help them understand your maintenance people. Help them understand your facilities people. Help them understand your space managers or reimbursement analysts, whoever that is. And when you can do that persona development and describe for them the outcomes you're trying to achieve to drive those personas, ultimately in the end you're going to be successful. And I think Barbara summed it up again best when she says, who's going to hold the responsibility for thousands of decisions and will bear the most direct impact on all of those decisions? The answer is, of course, the owner. We can't do this without you. Right? The AEC industry can't drive process transformation for an owner if you can't help us and be an active participant in that process. So Brian, I think there were a couple questions that came in. There was one in particular I saw, Brian, that I thought we could both address, and that was what if facilities building drawings are all currently in AutoCAD? What's the process then?
That's a great one. As a matter of fact, we taught a class at Autodesk University last year that started with an AutoCAD background and showed how quickly and easily you can construct a Revit model using primarily floors and walls, doors and windows to quickly represent space from an FM standpoint. So getting the spaces modeled, getting basic assets into the system, not modeling the entire mechanical system, which is not not necessarily and also can be cost prohibitive. But if you've got existing facilities, it's quite easy to bring in an AutoCAD background and begin to develop basic, I would say, LOD 200 models. Chuck, you think that's probably about
for most
level?
elements, yeah.
For most elements, for getting the basic space in there and maybe some of the basic equipment. You can actually do that quite easily in Revit because it's parametric. It allows you to be able to draw those walls and doors really quickly. I took a class a couple of weeks ago, a Paul Albin interiors class at BIM workshops on the West Coast, and I am not. I'm a basic Revit person. I'm not that great, but what I realized was in his 1 hour class, I was doing most of the work that is really required to take a basic AutoCAD drawing and turn it into a successful facility model.
And Brian, I think you can also, within your platform, within FM Interact, it's not flipping a switch either, right?
No.
As you start to transition some of your buildings to building information modeling, they can be integrated with those buildings that are still using CAD-based processes, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. You can have a hybrid environment. The majority of our customers are coming from more of a traditional AutoCAD-based, 2D-based environment. You can begin to bring those new facilities online that you've got Revit models for, develop models for those existing facilities. You can even start in a way, if you're using our FMX5 viewer, which is built into FM Interact. When I'm looking at a facility plan, honestly, I can't tell the difference between an AutoCAD drawing and a Revit model. However, if you want to get more sophisticated and provide those 3D, really dynamic 3D models, the Autodesk A360 viewer is the way to go, and that's in our product as well.
So, Brian, I want to expand upon something you said. So you mentioned the idea of creating simple models. So for all of you out there who have a lot of existing floor plans in AutoCAD, you're going to ultimately have to cost justify or create the business case justification for transitioning to BIM. We actually at Autodesk produced a space management white paper about 2 years ago. And in that space management white paper, we looked at some case studies. And one of the case studies was a healthcare organization that effectively doubled the amount of productivity they could get. So when they were polylining in AutoCAD, they were doing about 5,000 square foot per hour. When they transitioned into taking advantage of spaces and rooms inside of Revit, their productivity went to 10,000 square foot per hour. So that increased productivity is how they were actually justifying in year one the conversion of their AutoCAD plans to lightweight walls, doors, windows, and floors models. So if you think about the idea of creating a very simple model for the purposes of space, you have the opportunity for a business case justification. Then you can start to think about, and we hear this multiple times from campuses such as Western Michigan, Ohio State, and others that are modeling or have modeled their entire campus, is once I have the models, now I start to find all these other uses for the models. Campus visualization, helping a professor or a doctor or somebody understand what the space is going to look like. Energy modeling, being able to take those lightweight models, do order of magnitude campus-wide energy studies and stuff like that. There's a myriad of things that you can do with the models downstream. So don't think that in order to get started, you have to have this highly sophisticated model. Walls, doors, windows, floors, enough level of development, 200 to 300 elements that can define a room, can now help you define space, taking advantage of everything we've talked to you about today, and that can be a really good entry point into that process.
Chuck, I just want to answer one more question. We're running up against our hour. I wanted to say one thing, a couple of things. First of all, this is recorded. We will be providing the slides, a copy of the slides and the recording to everyone who attended, as well as to everyone who didn't. They'll be getting a follow-up email from us letting them know that the recording is available. So if you want to watch it again, that'd be great. So the last question, we had someone ask us, how do we handle open space environments? So out of the box Revit, Chuck, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I'll just go ahead and say it. Out of the box Revit, with the tools they have, it's a little bit complex to handle open office environments with the rooms and areas tools. We have a plugin in our Revit plugin that creates that bidirectional connection to FM Interact. We've got a tool that converts all of those so that all of your spaces inside of FM Interact we don't separate the difference between the rooms and the spaces. They're all just areas that need to get numbered just the way facility managers number them. So we handle it incredibly well, especially if you've got open office environments, cubicles, maybe spaces for hoteling. All of that is easily managed with our tool. So I just wanted to answer that as well. So I think we're just about out of time, okay. Chuck. Anything else? Any closing comments?
No, I mean, so as you start down this process, my only advice to all of you is remember that it is a process discussion. Start with the 3 questions, figure out whose problem you're trying to solve, and then start executing against that problem. And if you can do that, I think you'll find your level of success will grow tremendously.
Right, and the last thing is if there are a few questions, if you want to stay on the line and keep typing your questions in, what we don't answer live, we will follow up with you and provide those answers to any questions that we didn't get to. And Chuck, I really think you're absolutely right about that. Don't expect, if you're not involved during the AEC process, for you to get a model that's going to meet your needs. If you're a building owner, we recommend that you communicate those, provide guidelines to those teams, not only for new construction, but if you're going to be doing something to an existing facility, get involved early, let them know what your needs are. We find that most people are really cooperative and highly collaborative. They want to provide that information to you as long as they understand the expectation that they need that. So get involved early, communicate those needs, and you're going to be successful.
I think we're done.
So Leisha, I think we're done. I think we'll just go ahead and wrap up now. Thank you so much. I want to say a special thanks to Chuck Meese, my fellow lover of BIM for facilities management, for joining me on this webcast. I'm always excited to present with Chuck. Thank you, Chuck.
My pleasure, Brian. I appreciate it. Thank you all for your time today.